Back in the year of 1878, the land stretched out from the front porch of Thomas Calloway's cabin like a worn brown carpet, endlessly vast and indifferent. Wind, like a persistent, unseen mourner, keened around the corners of the small, stout structure, carrying with it the scent of dust and distance. Thomas lived in that distance, carved out a solitary existence in the unforgiving territory where Nebraska bled into Dakota. He was a man shaped by loss, his grief, a physical weight carried in the slump of his shoulders, the perpetual squint in his eyes. The raw, untamed prairie suited him. Its silence echoed his own, its harshness mirrored the landscape of his soul. His wife, Sarah, and their infant son had been taken by the fever 3 years prior, leaving him adrift in a sea of sorrow he couldn't navigate, only endure. He worked the small ranch he'd built with his own hands, the labor a dull balm against the sharp edges of memory, the tending of cattle, a mute conversation with the empty space where a family should have been. His nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, the nearest town a collection of dusty buildings clinging to the railroad tracks, filled with wary eyes and judgmental tongues. He visited only when necessity demanded, selling cattle, buying supplies, enduring the quiet stares of people who knew his story or thought they did. His life was a rhythm of solitude, the lowing of cattle, the creak of his saddle, the crackle of his fire, the relentless sigh of the wind. It was a life devoid of softness, of comfort, of connection. He wanted it that way, or told himself he did. Connection had cost him everything once. He wouldn't risk it again. He was a man weathering a storm that had already passed, stuck in its lingering, chilling wake. The letter came one harsh spring day, delivered by a tired rider who looked as though he'd swallowed the prairie dust whole. It was from a man named Brody, someone Thomas had met once, a trader who dealt in everything from horses to hides to people, rumor had it. The contents of the letter were brief, stark, and delivered a shock that cut through Thomas's habitual numbness. Brody had acquired a young woman, a Cheyenne, through means that were unspecified but easily imagined. Her father, the letter stated with chilling casualness, had been in debt. Brody was offering her to Thomas, knowing Thomas needed help on the ranch, knowing Thomas had means. He'd heard Thomas had bought an Indian pony once, stubborn and strong. Perhaps, Brody implied, he'd take to this one too. The price was steep. Brody would be passing through in 3 days. Thomas was to be ready to accept, or forfeit the opportunity. Thomas stared at the letter, crumpled it in his hand. He felt a wave of revulsion, sharp and bitter. Buying a person. It was monstrous, yet Brody's reputation preceded him. To refuse might mean this woman, this Nahili, would fall into far worse hands, hands that saw only chattel, only a body to be broken or used. The letter mentioned her name, an unexpected human detail in the brutal proposition. Nahili, a Cheyenne woman, sold like livestock. He had no need for a wife, certainly not one acquired this way. He had no desire for company. But the image of her fate, left to the mercies of a man like Brody, and whatever twisted market he served, sat like a stone in his gut. It wasn't right. Nothing about it was right, but maybe, just maybe, he could offer a different kind of wrong, a less terrible one. The vast, empty ranch was his, isolated, far from the prying, judgmental eyes of town. He could offer a roof, food, a measure of safety from the world that had already failed her so utterly. He wouldn't touch her, wouldn't make her a wife. He'd offer her refuge, if she would take it. The 3 days stretched into an eternity. Thomas wrestled with the decision, the ethical rot of it, the sheer impossibility of bringing another soul, especially one so wronged and vulnerable, into his desolate life. But the thought of Brody, of the men who dealt in such transactions, of the woman caught in their web, gnawed at him. When the 3rd day dawned, bright and cold, he stood by the corral, the money heavy in his pocket. He hated himself, hated the world that made such choices necessary. Brody arrived in the late afternoon, the setting sun casting long skeletal shadows across the prairie. He was a thick, florid man, his eyes hard and devoid of warmth. Behind his wagon, tied to a lead rope, walked a woman. She was smaller than Thomas expected, wrapped in a thin, worn blanket despite the chill air. Her head was bowed, dark hair obscuring her face. Brody barked something at her, a rough sound that made Thomas flinch inwardly. The woman stopped, silent, still. "Calloway," Brody said, a grin splitting his face. Got her right here, Nahili. Good stock, they say. Quiet. Thomas didn't look at Brody. His gaze was fixed on the woman. She wasn't livestock. She was a person, standing there, radiating a profound weariness that went bone deep. Her name was Nahili. He paid the money, counted it out, not looking at Brody's greedy hands. Brody untied the rope. She's yours now. Don't speak much English. Keep her in line. He laughed, a coarse, unpleasant sound, then climbed back into his wagon. Pleasure doing business, Calloway. He drove away, swallowed by the deepening twilight. Thomas stood alone with the woman. The wind whipped her blanket around her legs. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. The silence stretched between them, vast as the land. It was not his usual comfortable silence, but one thick with unspoken fear, shame, and a transaction that hung heavy in the air. Nahili, he said, his voice rough from disuse, softer than he expected. She flinched slightly at her name, but still didn't look at him. My name is Thomas, he said, speaking slowly, clearly. He gestured towards the cabin. House. Warm. Food. She raised her head then, her eyes meeting his for the first time. They were dark, luminous, filled with a pain so deep it made him ache. But there was something else there too, a flicker of something he couldn't name. Resilience? Defiance? It was buried beneath layers of sorrow and exhaustion, but it was there. She looked from him to the cabin, then back at him. Her gaze was assessing, cautious, like a wild creature cornered but still considering its options. She didn't speak. Come, he said, turning towards the cabin, walking slowly, giving her space, not looking back immediately. He heard the soft shuffle of her worn moccasins on the dirt path a moment later. She was following. The inside of the cabin was simple, functional. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, a fireplace that served for heating and cooking. It was clean, but bare. It smelled of wood smoke and dust and loneliness. He gestured towards the fire. Sit. She hesitated, then moved to the hearth, sinking onto the floor near the warmth, still wrapped in her blanket, pulling her knees to her chest. She watched him with those dark, wary eyes. He felt acutely aware of his size, his presence, the sheer strangeness of the situation. He busied himself, stoking the fire, heating water, preparing a simple meal of beans and salted pork. He worked in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the murmur of the wind outside. He could feel her eyes on him, observing his every move. It wasn't judgment, not yet, it was survival. He served her the food on a tin plate, setting it on the floor beside her. She looked at it, then at him. He nodded. Eat, you need strength. She ate slowly at first, then with more urgency, as if afraid the food might be taken away. He watched her, a knot tightening in his chest. How long had it been since she'd eaten properly? What horrors had she endured before Brody, and with him? He pushed the thoughts away. It didn't matter now. She was here. He had made a choice, a terrible, necessary one. Now he had to live with it, and help her live. He ate his own meal, separated by the space between the table and the hearth. The silence returned, less tense than outside, but still heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of their forced proximity. He finished eating, cleaned his plate, and moved to his bed. There is a pallet, he said, gesturing to a rolled blanket and piece of canvas near the opposite wall. For you. He hesitated. I will not harm you. He said the words carefully, hoping she understood. Her eyes flickered. A muscle twitched in her jaw. It was the closest thing to a verbal response he'd gotten. She waited until he had settled on his bed, fully clothed, facing away from her. Only then did she unwrap her blanket, revealing simple, worn dress, and move to the pallet, unrolling it on the floor. She lay down, facing the wall, her back to him. The small cabin felt impossibly large and impossibly small at the same time, holding 2 strangers bound by a transaction neither had sought. Sleep came slowly for Thomas. He listened to the wind, to the settling of the cabin, to the faint, shallow sound of Nahili's breathing across the room. He wondered about her life before, about what she thought of him, the man who had bought her. He didn't expect answers. He didn't even know if he wanted them. Days turned into a week. A fragile routine began to form, built on necessity and unspoken rules. Thomas worked the ranch. Nahili stayed near the cabin. She didn't try to run, which surprised him. Perhaps she had nowhere to go. Or perhaps she understood, with the keen perception of the dispossessed, that this grim solitude offered a different kind of protection. Communication was minimal, reliant on gestures and single words. Thomas would point to chores, fetching water from the well, gathering wood, helping with the small vegetable patch he maintained. Nahili performed them quietly, efficiently, with a surprising strength in her small frame. She was observant, learning his routines before he even articulated them. She saw the way he favored his left shoulder after a long day, the way he always checked the back fence first in the morning. He learned things about her too, through observation. She moved with a quiet grace, her feet almost silent on the ground. She seemed attuned to the natural world, noticing the changes in the wind, the behavior of the birds. She cleaned the cabin meticulously, scrubbing the floor until the wood was pale, washing the tin plates until they gleamed. She didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. She simply existed, a quiet, watchful presence in his formerly empty home. The silence between them remained, but it shifted. The initial tension began to dissipate, replaced by a shared understanding born of mutual observation and proximity. It wasn't comfort, not yet. But it wasn't active hostility either. It was coexistence, an uneasy truce enforced by circumstance. One afternoon he was mending a broken fence post, struggling with a particularly stubborn rock. He heard her approach, unheard until she was almost beside him. She knelt, examining the problem. Without a word, she pointed to a different angle, a place where the rock was weaker. He looked, surprised, then tried it. It worked. The rock shifted, the post settled firm. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She met his eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging his gratitude. It was the first time she had offered unsolicited help, the first small bridge built between them, not of words, but of shared effort and quiet competence. Slowly, tentatively, he began to offer small kindnesses. He bought her a thicker blanket on his next trip to town, ignoring the curious stares of the merchants. He left her a few apples he'd bought, setting them on the table without comment. He didn't ask about her past, the father who had sold her, the pain in her eyes. He sensed it was a wound too deep to probe. He simply provided, a silent guardian against the harsh world that had cast her out. Her presence changed the cabin, subtle shifts at first. A wild sprig of prairie sage left on the table, filling the air with its clean, sharp scent. The fire always banked correctly when he came inside from the cold, small, quiet acts of care. He found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin, the relief that settled over him not just from the end of labor, but from the knowledge that he wouldn't be returning to an empty space. He still slept on his bed, she on her pallet. The unspoken boundary remained, a clear line drawn in the dust of the floor. He respected it. She respected the fragile safety he offered. It wasn't a marriage. It wasn't even friendship, not in the way he understood it. It was something else, something born of necessity and shared quiet, a bond forged in the absence of other options. Then came the incident in town. Thomas had gone to sell some cattle, Nahili staying behind as always. He hated leaving her alone, a new, unsettling worry. He delivered the herd, collected his payment, and was getting ready to leave when a group of men blocked his path near the saloon. They were the usual sort, loud, swaggering, fueled by whiskey and a sense of entitlement. Brody, it turned out, had talked. "Here you got yourself a squaw, Calloway, the biggest one," a man named Miller with a pockmarked face sneered. Thomas felt a cold knot form in his gut. He kept his face impassive. "She works for me." "Works, huh?" another man chortled. "Heard Brody said he sold her like a piece of property." "Your property now, is she?" "She's under my roof," Thomas said, his voice low. "She's not to be bothered." Miller stepped closer, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Bought yourself a heathen woman. What kind of man does that? Not right, Calloway, not natural." The word bought stung, a sharp reminder of the ugly truth of her arrival, the part of him that felt complicit in the world's cruelty. But the insult, the contempt in their voices, ignited a slow, burning anger he hadn't felt in years, an anger that had nothing to do with his own pain and everything to do with the woman waiting back at his ranch. "My business," Thomas said, his hand drifting closer to the Colt on his hip. Miller saw the movement. His eyes narrowed. "Think you're too good for the rest of us now, Calloway? With your little Indian pet?" "She is not a pet," Thomas said, the words clipped and dangerous. Miller laughed, a harsh bark. "What is she then? Your wife? A squaw wife?" He grabbed Thomas's arm. "Maybe we ought to see what old Calloway's hiding out there. Maybe she needs civilization." That was it. The threat, the implication, the sheer ugliness of their prejudice and entitlement broke something in Thomas. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Nahili, about the fragile safety he had promised, however implicitly. He didn't hesitate. His fist shot out, connecting with Miller's jaw. The man staggered back, surprised. The others lunged. Thomas was outnumbered, but the rage fueled him. He fought with a quiet ferocity born of grief and protective instinct. He wasn't a brawler, but he was strong from years of hard labor, and the thought of those men going near Nahili gave him a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Punches flew, blood was spilled, chairs were overturned. He took blows, felt the sting of knuckles on his face, the tearing of his shirt. But he gave as good as he got, focused on putting them down, on making them regret the words they'd spoken, the threat they'd made. When it was over, Thomas stood bruised and bleeding amidst the wreckage of the saloon porch, the other men nursing their own injuries or sprawled on the ground. Sheriff Gable, a weary man who preferred his town quiet, arrived, surveying the scene with a sigh. "What in tarnation, Calloway?" Gable asked. "They threatened my place," Thomas said, wiping blood from his lip. "Threatened the woman staying there." Gable looked at the other men, then back at Thomas. He knew Miller and his ilk. He knew Calloway was a quiet man, not prone to trouble. "Get on home, Calloway," Gable said, his voice tired. "Before someone decides to press charges." Thomas nodded, his body aching, his heart hammering. He didn't wait. He mounted his horse and rode hard, the setting sun at his back, the image of Nahili alone at the ranch driving him. He needed to make sure she was safe. He needed to tell her. He reached the ranch as darkness fell. The cabin was quiet, a faint light glowing from the window. He dismounted, sore and weary, and went inside. Nahili was by the fire, cooking something that smelled of roasted roots. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening slightly when she saw his bruised face, his torn clothes. For the first time he saw not weariness but concern. She rose and came to him, her movements hesitant but determined. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing his cheek, her touch feather light. "Town?" she asked, her voice soft, the single word clear. It was the most she had spoken at once since she arrived. He nodded, wincing slightly. "Trouble, they said things, about you." He hesitated, finding the words difficult. "They meant harm, I stopped them." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. She saw the bruises, the fatigue, but she also saw something else, the quiet strength, the protective anger that had brought him home like this. She didn't ask how, she didn't ask why he had done it. She seemed to understand, on a level that transcended language, the choice he had made. He hadn't just protected his property, he had protected her. She didn't speak. Instead, she turned and went to fetch a clean cloth and some water. She came back and gently began to clean his cuts, her touch careful and unexpectedly tender. He stood still, allowing her to minister to him. Her fingers were cool and skilled, tracing the lines of his bruises, wiping away the blood. The silence between them was different now, no longer empty or tense, but filled with a quiet understanding, a recognition of shared vulnerability and unexpected protection. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair. He sat. She brought him food. They ate together, the small table no longer a barrier, but a shared space. He still didn't speak of the transaction, the buying and selling. But in that moment, under the soft glow of the firelight, with her quiet presence beside him, the ugliness of how she had come to be here seemed to recede, replaced by the quiet, earned reality of their present. The fight in town changed things irrevocably. The threat was real now, tangible. Those men, and others like them, wouldn't forget. And Thomas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would defend Nahili, defend their fragile peace, with everything he had. He hadn't bought a wife or a servant. He had, unknowingly, bought a responsibility, yes, but also a beginning. The days that followed were different. The reserve between them began to crack, chipped away by the shared knowledge of the external danger and the internal shift it had caused. Thomas found himself talking to her more, explaining the ranch work, telling her about the cattle, the land. He spoke slowly, simply, and she listened, her gaze steady, missing nothing. Sometimes she would offer a word, a question, tentative at first, then with more confidence. She, in turn, began to share small pieces of herself. She showed him how to find edible roots and herbs he'd never noticed, teaching him about the land he thought he knew. She spoke of the spirits in the wind and the trees, a worldview so different from his own practical one, yet expressed with such quiet conviction that he found himself listening, fascinated. She spoke a little about her people, the beauty of their ways, the pain of their displacement. She never spoke of her father or the sale, but the sorrow when she spoke of her past was a palpable thing. One evening, sitting by the fire, she finally asked a question that had clearly been weighing on her. "Why?" she asked, her dark eyes fixed on his. "Why did you buy me?" The word hung in the air, raw and unforgiving. Thomas looked into the fire, choosing his words carefully. There was no easy answer, no way to make the transaction clean. "Brody," he said. "He's not a good man, I heard. I heard where you might go, what might happen. It wasn't right." He met her gaze, letting her see the truth of it. I didn't want that for you." He paused. I couldn't just let it happen." He waited for her reaction, for accusation, for contempt. But she simply looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. "You saved me," she said, the simple words a profound statement. "I tried to offer safety," he corrected, his voice quiet. It's not the way things should be." "No," she agreed, her voice low. "Not the way things should be." A flicker of sadness crossed her face. "My father, he was desperate, lost. He thought this was the only way." She looked at her hands, clasped in her lap. It hurt. It hurt. Two simple words that carried the weight of betrayal and abandonment. Thomas felt a surge of fierce protectiveness, not just physical, but emotional. He wanted to shield her from all the hurt the world had dealt her. "I know," he said softly. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her she was safe now, that he would not hurt her, that her worth was not measured in dollars. But the words felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what she had experienced. Instead, he simply held her gaze, a silent promise passing between them. Their days fell into a comfortable rhythm. They worked together, shared meals, spoke in quiet tones. The ranch began to feel less like a prison of solitude and more like a shared haven. Nahili brought a quiet grace to the rugged place. She planted flowers outside the cabin door, small bursts of color against the brown earth. She sang sometimes, soft, melodic songs in her own language that Thomas didn't understand but found deeply soothing. He saw her not as the woman he had bought, but as Nahili, a person of quiet strength and resilience, with a deep well of sorrow and a capacity for gentle kindness. He found himself watching her when she didn't know, admiring the way she moved, the quiet determination in her eyes. The emptiness in him began to recede, slowly, like the winter snowmelt. Grief was still there, a scar, but it no longer defined his entire landscape. There was room for something new, something unexpected. The external conflict hadn't vanished, however. The men from town nursed grudges. Whispers reached Thomas, threats muttered in saloons, talk of running the squaw off, of taking the land from the man who defied them. One evening, a few of them rode out, circling the ranch perimeter, firing shots into the air, a clear intimidation tactic. Thomas and Nahili stood together by the corral, watching the figures against the twilight sky. Nahili didn't tremble, though he felt a tremor in her hand when his own closed around it. She was scared, but her resolve was unwavering. "They will come back," she said, her voice quiet. "Let them," Thomas replied, his grip tightening on her hand. "We'll be ready." He spent the next few days preparing, boarding up windows, checking his rifle, teaching Nahili how to load the spare pistol. She learned quickly, her movements precise. There was no fear in her eyes then, only grim determination. This wasn't just his fight, it was theirs. This was their home, their peace, and they would defend it together. The attack came under the cover of a moonless night. They were ready. Thomas had Nahili hide in the root cellar, the safest place, with a loaded pistol and a lantern. He took position by the front window, rifle in hand. He heard them first, the sound of horses and low voices. Then the cabin door was kicked in with a splintering crash. Men poured in, silhouetted against the faint light from outside. "Calloway," Miller's voice roared. "Send out the squaw, or we burn you out." Thomas fired. The shot echoed in the small space. A man went down with a cry. Chaos erupted. Glass shattered as others fired back. Thomas ducked behind a table, reloading. He could hear shouts, curses, the thud of boots. He fired again, aiming low. Another cry. They were retreating, surprised by his resistance. He heard footsteps on the roof, someone trying to get at the chimney. He fired a shot through the ceiling. Suddenly, he heard a commotion from the back. They had found the cellar entrance. He felt a cold dread grip him. Nahili was there. He burst from the front door, ignoring the pain in his ribs where he'd been hit in town. He raced around the cabin just as two men were trying to force open the heavy cellar door. One had a lantern. "Leave her alone," Thomas yelled, raising his rifle. They turned, startled. Before they could react, a shot rang out from inside the cellar. One of the men crumpled, clutching his arm. Nahili had used the pistol. The other man hesitated for a second, then turned his attention back to the cellar door, but Thomas was on him, tackling him hard. They wrestled in the dirt, the lantern rolling away, plunging them into deeper shadow. Thomas landed punches, fueled by adrenaline and the primal need to protect. More men were coming around the corner. He was outnumbered again. He heard a shout from the front of the cabin. The others were coming back. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness beside the cabin. Nahili. She hadn't stayed in the cellar. She had slipped out another way, circled around. She held a burning brand from the fire, swung it low and hard at the legs of the approaching men. They stumbled back with cries of surprise and pain. Seeing his opportunity, Thomas landed a final blow on the man he was fighting, scrambling to his feet. He grabbed Nahili's arm. "Back inside." They retreated into the bullet-riddled cabin. The attackers, disoriented and injured, seemed to reconsider. The element of surprise was gone. Thomas and Nahili were armed and clearly willing to fight back, hard. "This ain't worth it," one of the men yelled. "We'll be back, Calloway," Miller roared, but the threat lacked conviction. They mounted their horses and rode off into the night, their retreat marked by receding shouts and the sound of hooves. Silence fell again, but it was a different silence than before, heavy with the smell of gunpowder and fear, but also charged with the energy of survival, of victory. Thomas leaned against the wall, rifle still clutched in his hand, body aching. Nahili stood beside him, the smoking brand still held tight. Her chest was heaving, but her eyes, even in the dim light, shone with a fierce light he hadn't seen before. They had faced the threat together. They had fought together. He looked at her, at the small woman who had used the pistol he'd given her, who had faced down armed men with a burning stick. She hadn't been a victim, she had been a warrior. He reached out, took the brand from her hand, and let it fall to the floor. His hand cupped her cheek, rough and calloused. Her skin was smooth beneath his touch. "You came out," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You needed help," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "You protected me, I protect you." In those simple words, everything shifted. It wasn't about buying and selling, about owner and property. It was about mutual protection, about standing together against a harsh world. It was about choosing each other. "Nahili," he said again, her name on his lips feeling like a discovery. She leaned into his touch, her dark eyes searching his. There was no longer any wariness, only trust, and something deeper, something that mirrored the profound shift happening within him. He didn't know what the future held. Those men might come back. The world outside still judged, still hated. But inside the small, damaged cabin, a new truth had taken root. He hadn't just found help, or a way to assuage his guilt. He had found a partner. He had found a connection that had risen from the ashes of his grief and the ugliness of her arrival. He had found a different kind of belonging. They stood like that for a long moment, silhouetted against the damaged cabin, the wind sighing outside, no longer a mourner, but a witness. The prairie was still vast and indifferent, But inside their small space, forged in hardship and defended with courage, something resilient, something quietly beautiful, had begun to bloom. The damage to the cabin was repaired slowly, piece by piece, a physical manifestation of their rebuilding. They worked together, falling into a comfortable rhythm, their movements synchronized. The quiet between them was now companionable, filled with shared glances, small smiles, the ease of two people who understood each other without needing words. The townsfolk left them alone after that night, at least directly. The message had been sent and received. Thomas Calloway and the Indian woman were not easy prey. Whispers still circulated, glances were still wary when Thomas went to town, but the open hostility had retreated, replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. Life on the ranch found its rhythm, but it was a different rhythm now. It was no longer a solitary endurance, but a shared existence. They expanded the garden, built a small chicken coop, talked about getting a few milk cows. They were building something more than just a living, they were building a life, together. The boundary of the pallet on the floor and the bed remained for a time, a silent acknowledgement of the unconventional start to their relationship, the scars they both carried. But the space between them lessened, filled with shared laughter, quiet conversations, the growing ease of touch, a hand on an arm, a shoulder bumped while working side by side. One cold autumn evening, the wind howling outside, rattling the window panes, they were sitting by the fire after supper. The silence was warm and comfortable. Nahili looked at Thomas, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "The cold comes," she said softly. He nodded. Winter on the prairie was harsh, isolating. She looked towards her pallet, then towards his bed. Her gaze returned to his, steady and open. "The floor is cold." It was an invitation, simple and direct. An acknowledgement of the intimacy that had grown between them, transcending the transactional beginning, born of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet unfolding of affection. Thomas looked at her, at the woman who had faced down attackers with a burning stick, who had brought quiet beauty and unexpected warmth into his desolate life. He saw her resilience, her strength, her vulnerability, her quiet grace. He saw the future he hadn't dared to imagine. "Yes," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "it is." He rose and walked the short distance to her, offering his hand. She took it, her fingers warm in his. He helped her up. Together they walked to his bed. The boundary was gone, dissolved not by decree or expectation, but by the quiet, steady current of human connection that had found its way into their lives despite the world's cruelty. He hadn't bought a wife, but in the crucible of shared survival and quiet understanding, he had found something real, something true, something that felt, finally, like coming home. The vast indifferent prairie still surrounded them, but within the small cabin, two souls who had been lost and alone had found their place, together. The grief was still a part of him, a shadow in the corners of his heart, but it was no longer all of him. There was light now, too, the quiet, steady light of shared life, of belonging, of an unexpected, earned love that had bloomed in the most unlikely soil.